Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Dear viewers, welcome back to our Development Dialogue show. Today we are in Bristol at Hotel Marriott attending the UN Dialogue on Sustainable Development Goal. With me, we have got Paul Ludd, the Director of UNDP, and Martin Palmer, the Secretary General of Alliance of Religion and Conservation, founded by His Royal Highness Prince Philip. Before going further, I asked Martin, who is the main organizer, Martin and Paul, tell us why do you think the faith community should get involved, and tell us a bit the background of how this dialogue has taken place universally, have brought in Muslim, Christian, Hindus, Jews, all leaders across the world.
Well, why I think, Saif, is that many of the issues that the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are targeting are areas where the faiths have been active for centuries, if not millennia at times. Some of them are areas where, in fact, the faiths need to engage much more deeply. I think an issue that has come out very strongly during the conference has been the whole area of gender equality, where faiths are somewhat behind on that. But if we're talking about, for example, healthcare, if we're talking about education, if we're talking about lifestyle changes, about protection of ecology, then the faiths have quite a good track record there. And in a sense, my understanding, but Paul may well be able to correct this, is that the UN is looking in these Sustainable Development Goals not just for national governments to take up these issues and make them priorities, but in a sense to involve the whole of civil society. And frankly, with the exception of North Korea, every single country, civil society is predominantly religious, and the religions are often the most well-organized, along with the education sector, and the most well-organized sectors. So from the faith's perspective, we are excited, faiths are excited to be invited to the table, to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, to partner with them, to do them anyway because it's what we do, because it's faithful, to be pushed to do more, because the UN is raising key questions to us, as are other partners here, such as the World Bank and some of the conservation and development agencies. So I think it's a meeting that is natural. It's a meeting, however, that has arisen from work that ARC has been doing with the UNDP for the last nearly 10 years on looking at how the faiths can develop long-term plans, not just grand statements of support for UN objectives, but actually say, well, and this is what we'll practically do. And that's what the Bristol commitments that we launched yesterday, that Paul received from the many faith leaders here, are all about.
Paul, we are very intrigued that UNDP has taken this bold step to consult the faith groups, and Martin has been able to bring in over 10 faiths, if I'm correct?
Well, we got 11 faiths here and 24 different traditions.
It's fantastic, the conglomeration of the collective wisdom across the globe has brought in at the footsteps of the UNDP and the United Nations. So tell us, why did you suddenly felt that, or not suddenly felt that it is important to consult the faith groups?
The new Sustainable Development Goals, or the Global Goals for Sustainable Development, as they're being called, will be signed by the head of every government later on this month in New York in September. And they set out global aspirations for every country. So they're owned by every country. But what we in the UN, the job that we'll be playing over the next 15 years as the civil service of the UN, will be to encourage faster progress, to work with governments, to work with business, to work with civil society on actually making them happen on the ground. Now, as over 8 out of 10 people in the world profess a religious affiliation, I mean, it certainly makes sense to us to engage with faith communities, partly on the work that they're already doing that's contributing to this agenda, but then also to look into the future and see where trajectories need to change, where there are particular challenges that need unlocking if we're going to make progress on the goals. So for us, it's only natural to engage with faith communities, to have that discussion very early on before we start the framework, to see where we can forge common partnerships for progress.
Yes, I mean, it's very refreshing to know that you have been into the NGO sector, having worked in the Christian aid. So you have got a much more better grasp of the issues. But tell us, from your experience, how do you see the faith communities can assist United Nations or help achieve the 17 goals. Very ambitious indeed.
Well, there are two key ways. I mean, the first way is that, of course, many faiths and their institutional architecture, their organisations, are directly involved in projects and programmes at the community level. They may be delivering services, they may be promoting employment schemes, but they're very micro projects at the community level. The second way, which is, I think, equally and possibly more important, is the moral authority that faiths have in their own dialogues with governments and those in power, particularly where change is less about spending money and it's more about changing policy or changing behaviours. And I think the faiths will play a very important role in that dialogue with governments and business about how they need to change their policies and behaviours if we're to achieve the goals.
Excellent. I mean, Martin, does it mean that we are talking about applied faith, faith beyond doctrine, beyond rituals, and getting to the people?
Yes, I think we're talking about being faithful. We're talking about taking the core tenets of our faith. And we had a fascinating presentation this morning from one of our Muslim colleagues who said there are 700 verses in the Quran about creation, about nature, about the validity of all forms of life. And the application, if you like, of that wisdom, of that knowledge, is what we call being faithful. So, for example, one of the things that I found most striking in the Muslim community over the last 20 or 30 years has been the recovery of Islamic banking, non-usury finance, based on core Islamic principles, which to some extent kind of got a bit lost in much of the 20th century, but a recovery of those leading to now one of the largest investment groups in the world that have an ethical policy that is faithful. And I've watched how that model has encouraged Christian groups. We had a ban on usury until 1555 to re-explore our own traditions and to be more faithful. So yes, it's being active, but I think the phrase that we like is that we're being faithful. We are rediscovering the wisdom that sometimes we'd lost sight of, or people had said, oh, that's irrelevant now in the modern world, yes. And discovering actually there is nothing more relevant than that which we were taught in the past.
Yes, I mean, just my recent visit from Malaysia, that the emphasis on sukuk, the Islamic sort of bond to giving loans and so on to activate the employment engine and so on, is fascinating. And many non-Muslim economists are spending so much time doing their PhDs on identifying the Islamic methodology of sukuk and so on. So it's a fascinating development, and I think this is the rediscovery of the ancient, as you correctly said today, the ancient wisdom, to bringing them in and to apply them in today's form. One thing is bothering me too much, not bothering me too much in the sense that you last Millennium Development Goal, the objective of hunger and poverty, saying we will halve but this time we will end poverty in all its form and shape. It's a pretty robust declaration. Do you think you will be able to achieve that? And if you do, tell me what are the most critical aspects of it for tackling poverty?
It's a very interesting question. Let me address first, what's the right target? For the Millennium Development Goals, we had a target of halving income poverty, which from any analytical perspective, but including that from a faith background, leads you to the question, well, which half shall we concentrate on? And who shall we leave out? So there's a very, very testing set of questions when you're setting goals for a certain set of people, but then you're accepting that you're not going to be able to improve the lives of many others. Now, what the Sustainable Development Goals attempt to do is to make those commitments more aligned with, I would say, a human rights approach to tackling things like poverty, where the aspiration is correctly that nobody in this age of great wealth and great resources and great technology, there should be nobody really living in indignity or poverty. So I think the framing of the goal is correct. Now, whether or not it can be achieved, clearly is going to be a huge test for public policy and for the groups that help governments make these goals happen or not. What I would say is that it's not going to be as easy as, or twice as easy as, reducing poverty by half. The last mile of poverty is often associated with exclusion or discrimination or social exclusion, economic exclusion, political exclusion. So the modes and methods of reaching the people who are furthest to reach are going to be a little bit more expensive and a little bit more difficult. And it becomes more of a political issue, actually. Reducing poverty is not simply about transferring technology or resources. It's actually about questioning structures and working out whether they're fair. In faith terms, whether they're actually justice-based.
Right. So it's ambitious. It's a lot of political issues that needs to be addressed. A lot of issues of our international trade and debt, and in order of the multinationals avoiding taxes in third world countries. So many issues interconnected. It's a long haul. It's a long way to go. But in terms of the mobilization of the faith communities worldwide, I think there is a clear role that I can see for ARC to play. The way you mobilize this, how do you see yourself?
Well, I think it's not so much for ARC to play. ARC's role is to broker it, to make it possible for meetings like this to take place and therefore for new alliances to come forward. But I think the track record of the faiths, if we take the Jubilee movement that was working on the debt issue in around 2000, the whole fair trade movement, which has got its roots primarily in the religious world as well. I think the contribution of the faiths is that it can address some of the issues that Paul has absolutely rightly highlighted of the political and social constraints and vested interests that will be against overcoming poverty. And I think on top of that, and that's something that we traditionally have always addressed. I mean, last night, many of our delegates went to the evening prayer in the cathedral, and we had there the great song of Mary, the mother of Jesus, in which she talks about to throw down the powerful from their seat and raise up the weak, to send the rich empty away and feed the hungry and the poor. And so that's been an aspiration. I think one of the things that I found interesting in the conversations and in the plans coming from the faiths was to say, well, poverty is not just financial. Poverty can also be the poverty of your own soul, of your own spirit. It can be the poverty of the community that you live within. So you might well be above the whatever dollar rate it is per day that the World Bank or the UN would say is the poverty level. But you can be very poor in spirit as well. You can be very lonely in the midst of a huge city. You can be very lonely with money. You can be very lonely. You can be very bullied in jobs. You can be terrorized by a breakdown of relationships. So for the faiths, poverty is not just an economic issue. And I think one of the things I found very intriguing was when that was raised by the faiths during the last couple of days, was the way in which our UN colleagues went, yes, we agree, but we've got to deal with measurable. In a sense, what the faiths can tackle is, if you like, the not so much the unmeasurable, but sometimes the things that are more invisible, the things that are to do with actually the human spirit, not just the human income.
Yeah. I mean, in the last 2 days, the encounter, even the dinner last night, and this fascinating presentation by the black past of Bristol about the slavery. But one thing that was going in my mind was that those slavery, we could see the chains, but now the invisible chain that tie millions of slaves. And the analogy that he gave, the number of slave trade that went through Bristol is a tiny, minuscule of the current slaves that we are being dealing with. And yet, Paul, your comment, the last mile, last frontier that we need to cross to kill this poverty target is the most difficult one. And that's current slavery that we need to address. And I'm sure it is not written within any of the 17 goals. But somehow I felt that this is very important, that the current human slavery that is perpetuated across the globe because of there is a demand and supply of people's perverted requirement. Nevertheless, a question to you, how is United Nations, being a secular organization, coping with the recognition that it has to engage faith communities?
I think it takes time within a very large bureaucracy like the UN to sometimes convince colleagues why they need to do something. But for a few years now, we've had a very active cross-agency UN working group on faiths. It's headed up by one of my colleagues who's here in Bristol with us. And through that network, we work through the agencies to get buy-in to this ethos of working with faith communities. So in my own organisation, the UN Development Programme, we now have guidelines for interacting with faith-based organisations and communities at the country level, which is where the bulk of our work takes place. I mean, we do global policy and advocacy, including at meetings like this, but really the bulk of our work, the bulk of our investment is really at the country level. So what we try to do is to create the acceptance and structure whereby our colleagues can actually engage with faith communities at the country level. And many of them are sometimes reluctant to do that because they see more on the risk side than they do on the benefit side. So what we need to do is create a culture where they can actually take some of these risks and also learn of the benefits of engaging with faith communities for their own work and for their own work with governments.
I think it's sort of a continuous dialogue, and incrementally it can increase the activities of the day.
It is, but I think also, I mean, the next big event that ARC will be hosting with His Royal Highness Prince Philip in November will be bringing together the key people like Paul and others who have brokered partnerships between religion and secular bodies, precisely to draw up handbooks for different types of communities, whether it be UN or working with cities or working with conservation groups or working with development agencies, to actually say, here's how you do it. How do you start working with religions? Because there is a remarkable ignorance about what religions are actually up to. There is an enormous assumption that the most extreme forms of religion are the norm, whereas in fact, of course, they're far from it, they're completely marginal. And I think, therefore, there is a role from the faith side, and this is what ARC will be coordinating, for us to, as it were, say, this is how we work, and this is how we could work with you, and here's how we make decisions. It always amazes me when we start talking about the way in which faith communities make a decision, how democratic most faith organizations are in terms of making decisions. This is complete news to most people in the secular world who assume that there's either a pope or a caliph or an archbishop who just goes, you will do this, and everyone goes, yes, of course we will. Well, I'm an Anglican, I have an archbishop. To the best of my knowledge, I've never yet obeyed anything he said. But I do engage in all the conversations, the discussions, and the democratic processes. So I think there's that. I think there's also helping the secular groups to not focus in on religious leaders, the sort of the spokespersons, the sort of Dalai Lamas, the archbishops, and so forth. Because actually what we need to be working with, which is what ARC does, we need to work with the people who run the education systems for the faith, or who run the investment programs, or who are responsible for the properties, or who deal with the youth programs, or who deal with the training of the clergy, or the development of buildings. Those are the hands-on people who day by day are dealing with all the kind of issues that any secular group deals with, but they come at it in an attempt to be faithful and to be inspired by a tradition more than just a sort of economic justification or a common sense of humanity. And therefore, the next big goal for us, and we're doing this in collaboration with the UN and with the World Bank, is to look at how do we provide handbooks, guides, so that when people go, but how would we do it? We can say, aha.
Is the toolkit.
And we'll work with you on it.
Paul, by the time we were here, already 30 to 40 children died due to waterborne diseases. And every 20 seconds, this is one of the objectives within the 17 Millennium SDGs. How are you going to deal with it?
Well, it doesn't fall immediately under my portfolio, but of course we know through our own experience in the UK, and particularly in our cities, that investing in better waters and sanitation has been an absolute driver of development progress, allows children to go to school in a sustainable way and remain healthy throughout their lives. It's a big focus of the UN. We have very large programs that are coordinated by our agencies, funds and programs, and UNICEF is often at the forefront of those because of the focus on providing cleaner water and sanitation for children. So it's a very, very big focus for the UN. The other thing is that it mirrors much of the consultation that we've done with people around the world. You know, we often, and in particular in the last 2 years, we've actually asked people what they care about, what's important to them. And water and sanitation has consistently come, you know, within the top 5 or 6 priorities in many places around the world. So that will guide how the UN also plays its role in working with governments to deliver these sorts of services.
Martin, you have produced this Faith in the Future, the Faith and Sustainable Development Goals, the Bristol Commitments. This is a monumental achievement of yours. I mean, you have over 20 publications. I think this is one of the best edition. I mean, I was going through in the evening, reading through from the Chinese faith, from all faiths, their contribution. I think this would be an enormous addition to your research for the United Nations, this document that you have produced. Any thoughts on this publication, Martin?
One of the things that secular groups often think is that if they can get all the religions to sign one common statement, somehow that's going to change the world. Actually, the reason why we have a diversity of faiths, we work with, for example, over 60 different traditions within Christianity, 15 different traditions within Buddhism, is that we actually define ourselves by what it is that is different, that we can bring, that can make a difference. So what we always do is we ask each of the traditions, what is it that you will do? Possibly that nobody else would think of doing, but what is it that you will do with the resources you have, with the networks, with the infrastructure? Rather than have a common statement in which it is impossible to mention anything particular. So each of these statements, each of these commitments are grounded, first of all, in the infrastructure that each faith has. We run 50% of all the schools around the world. Secondly, each of them is grounded in the particular teaching that inspires you to be faithful. And that differs. What I come at from an Anglican perspective is very different from what a Catholic or an Armenian Orthodox comes at. Yes, we share a common faith, but we manifest that faith in different ways, and we need to honor that. And the third thing is to actually recognize that the faiths are already hugely active. We are providing 60% of medical care around the world. We don't have to be asked to do that, we're doing it. What is wonderful about this program with the SDGs is that we are being asked to come on board and to help. And that is what these Bristol commitments are about. These are actual statements of what we're doing and what we're going to do more and what we haven't done before, but we're now inspired to get on and do.
Thank you. We are coming to the end of the program. Paul, have you got any last message? This program will be viewed by most of the Muslim communities across England, although our viewers are from Europe and Middle East as well. Any final message for your viewers?
I would just reiterate that the world is at a critical juncture. It's facing some very difficult challenges around poverty and exclusion, inequality, climate change, degradation, intolerance, migration, how we treat refugees. Now more than ever, we actually need to come together as a global community to solve these problems. Now, governments later this month will agree a very ambitious development agenda that includes 17 goals. And I think my main message is that the UN is ready to work with faith communities around the world to make sure that these goals happen, as we will also work with governments, with business, and with secular civil society.
Martin, any final message?
Yes, I think as faiths, we should be proud of what we do. We should be proud of our record in so many sectors of social welfare and education and so forth. But we should also be open enough to recognize that there is more that we can do side by side, both with other faiths and with organizations like the UN, than we can do by ourselves. Part of our vision as people of faith should be that we should see the divine everywhere, not just in our own tradition.
Thank you very much.
Even in the UN.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Paul. Viewers, we have come to the conclusion, end of our program. Just to remind you, our zakat, 2.5% that we give, 22.5% of our surplus wealth is accumulated as a part and parcel of our faith. Why? because we need to wage a ceaseless struggle to end poverty in its all form and shape. Let us, one of the objective of Millennium Sustainable Development Goals is to end poverty by 2030. Let us commit that we will fight to achieve that goal alongside the United Nations and all the nations and all faith groups and all efforts that is being made towards achieving that. With that word, I conclude. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.